Greetings and welcome to a special edition of Hips News. Let me ask you a question out there. Where are you from? Do you know? Or better yet, who are you? Do you know your culture? If so, why? If you are black and born in America, then you are African American or Afro-American. If you're white from Europe, you're not called European American. What is the association with Africa? And not all African are black. Or better still, if you are white and born in Africa. Vessel 2 has asked these questions, and we are now about to take a dive into the African paradox.
Boulay, Ebony Jet, etc. And Vernon Jarrett was the host of the show, who I didn't know was head of the Boulay at that time, Chicago Tribune columnist. Started AXO for the NAACP. And one day I called in and I was trying to explain some of this stuff, and he cut me off. He said, we're not going to have any of that. I didn't know he was Boulay. When I ended up becoming special assistant to the mayor, the other special assistant was Erwin France, who was head of Model Cities under Mayor Daley. He was an alpha like the mayor, they buddies, all of this and that, but I was a threat to him, but I didn't know at that time he was head of the Boulay. It wasn't until later. And then that's when I went to my friends, my African-centered friends in Chicago, and said, hey, man, I'm researching these white folks, and I think I found the black folks connected to the white folks. And then I started finding black folks' names, African-centered black folks' names.
Greetings and welcome to a special edition of Hips News, the African Paradox. And with that, let's start. We're your hosts, Vessel 1
and Vessel 2.
Okay, Vessel 2, give me your thoughts. And I think this is going to be a very interesting episode.
Yeah, I was having a conversation with a coworker, and I posed the question: if we believe what we've been told and the origins of the planet started in Africa, that would make our species African from top to bottom.
Mm-hmm.
And he basically agreed. So I said, okay. And I asked, well, if that is the case, then by us living in Japan, then wouldn't Japanese people also be African? And he kind of looked at me puzzled, but then he said, yes, if you believe in what we've been told. And I made the statement that, well, you know, they don't see themselves as Africans, and there's no connection for them as far as calling themselves African Japanese or Japanese Africans. It doesn't exist, the terminology. And so then I asked the people in Australia, who we call the Aborigines, are they Australian or are they African? And then he looked at me again, and he was kind of puzzle-faced, and he said that they're Aboriginals of Australia. And I said, well, I've been there, and they don't claim to be African, but they claim to be Australian. So, yes, they are originally from Australia, but by bloodline, they're African, because everybody is African. And so he basically agreed upon that. So I posed the question. The next question was regarding America. Why is it that Black Americans, if that's the label that we're using, some people, why is it the push or the need to go back to Africa if we know that majority of us never came from Africa? And why is it that we picked up the term African American when growing up, majority of us have had conversations with our grandparents and some of us who were lucky enough to grow up around our great-grandparents. There was always stories about how we were indigenous to the land, which the Europeans ended up changing our names to Indians. So the question that I posed was, well, how come the Aboriginal Americans couldn't be black and not directly linked to Africa? And if that is the case, then shouldn't they be more focused on trying to get the resources that are in America, vice running to Africa, trying to get resources that might not necessarily be theirs?
You saw on that Boule tape when we were there messing at the convention, I told my buddies, we're not here to recruit them. We don't want them to be better brothers. We want to warn them that if they're the guard dog on white supremacy, when we jump the fence, what you going to do? You going to bite, you going to fight, or you going to run out and let us get to who we are?
So once again, I got a puzzled look. And the response was, yeah, I believe everybody is basically one species, one race, which is African, but everybody's born in different parts of the world. So you will be technically considered the Aboriginals of America. And I said, okay. So then that means, as Europeans are concerned, they are African as well. And then the conclusion to that was yes. So everybody, if you believe what we have been told, are African. So what is the proper terminology outside of all of us being African to label ourselves? And we both didn't have an answer for that. So I thought it was an interesting conversation.
That's great. Well, let's pose the question to our listeners. If you're out there and you have any answers or you have any feedback or you can give us feedback of some type of insight, if you're out there and you have it. But from a different perspective, I tend to agree with you with the analogy. Yes, because I think it's all about labels. They're trying to label things, try to keep things I don't know, cut and dry per se, or one-sided, you know. Maybe it could be for, of course, nefarious reasons of us not having the information needed to claim what's rightfully ours. You know, as you know, if we're the indigenous Aborigines of America, then if we know this or have some information or some documentation, then I think it would make a lot of the white counterparts uncomfortable, because it would prove that they have taken or stolen the land and changed information, so we're ignorant to the fact of knowing what is ours or where we come from.
Yeah, I think the proof is in the pudding. They should feel uncomfortable, but they don't.
Of course they don't.
I really, well, I'm gonna start referencing the American problem is not white or black. It is the government who did all of this. And if you really want to technically break down how the Europeans came and how the Africans came, it was all sanctioned by governments and churches. And the Europeans came as indentured servants, and they were ruled or under the rulership of their king. So when they came over, they were not coming over as themselves being colonizers. They were coming over as servants. But they weren't called slaves because they had some people say 7-year contract to work off whatever debt that they owed for the transportation coming over. And then once they worked off their debt, they were technically free. But that was all sanctioned by the government. And then all the states that they ended up creating, it was the government in each state that made the policies and the rules on how immigration was to come to America. So for us to say that it's white people, yeah, you could say that, but that's not sticking, because you can't hold a person liable just because they're white. It doesn't mean that they came or they did any harm to you. But if the torch was thrown in the direction of the governments and the states, then I think that's an argument to be made, because they still exist. They have the records of what they did. They know the policies that they created, and they know the discrimination within the policies that they wrote. So if anybody should be held accountable, it should be the state of New York, the people versus the state of Massachusetts, the people versus the state of Virginia, and so on. And that way, it's not going to be a color issue, and then the argument of this is racist or that's racist should just be eliminated. And the governments and the states and the federal holders of these positions now should answer the questions and right the wrong, take the color out of all of it, and just undo what you did, and then pay for the damages you caused by doing what you did.
Okay. Well, do you think this is do you think this includes reparations or
yes, I do. Okay. Because it wasn't necessarily, I mean, if you look at the history, it's not all white people who owned slaves. That's the first thing they're going to tell you.
Right.
My family didn't own slaves. Okay, fine. But it was white people who were making the laws. So that's why we have such a hard time having this argument, in my opinion, is because we're using their logic and terminology to justify getting something that we weren't supposed to never get. And by blaming them in the same regards as they discriminated against us isn't working.
Mm-hmm.
So you can't use their rules. You can't say, well, you're a racist, because then they're going to tell you that more or less you just don't like white people. Even though we might have justifiable reasons not to necessarily be cozy and fuzzy to white people, that's a dead argument now, I think. The argument should be, like I said, directed at the state level and federal level, and attack the states. The states are the ones that take the taxpayers' money anyway, so they have the money sitting there. And yes, that should include reparations, but I don't even know if reparations is the right term, because it was 1865,
right,
where they designated Oklahoma to Indians and black people.
Yes.
Right? So
yes.
They already made that law. So they need to just go ahead and honor the treaties that they broke between the Indians. They broke a lot of treaties between the so-called Indians, and they never really made any treaties with black people. That's what they called us. But as far as the indigenous people, they've already made treaties and they broke them. So they should honor these treaties. And there should not be a statute of limitation on these treaties. And I think if you take out the color mechanism and just make it, the government did this, it's in black and white, and they have to answer to it, then I don't see how they can wiggle out of that conversation.
Well, I think the biggest problem is the fact that, like you mentioned, everything was a cover-up or been hidden. So the question is that these documentations or these changes of descriptions of Americans or blacks or Africans or Negro or whatever they want to try to squeeze into what category, is the fact that if we can find the evidence of their changing and manipulating the rules and ideas of who is who and what race is what race, then that would be a lot a help to clarify what needs to be fixed.
I would say I agree with you, but it's all been documented. I think the reason why they really don't want to start teaching the 1619 project is once you start going that far back and uncovering what state did what when, then it's all there. If you ever read through year by year what they've done to certain people, certain groups of people, through the implementation of laws and regulations, then all the documentation is there already. It's just we are not attacking the documentation. We're attacking the people who look like the people who made the documentation.
Yeah, but I mean, if
if you stop attacking the people who look like the people who made the documentation and just attack the documentation and try to hold people accountable for the documentation, that's like here. If you get some paperwork from the city hall, and you take this paperwork back to city hall, and you know the person who wrote the paperwork from city hall was a Japanese person, and you just start screaming on every Japanese you see because the person who wrote the paper was Japanese, that's not going to get you nowhere.
Yeah.
But if you take the paperwork back to city hall and say, what's on this paperwork is incorrect, here's my proof that it's incorrect, you show them what you have to show them, you point out to where the corrections need to be made, then that lessens the tension, and then most likely you're going to get to the point and things are going to change. But if you just go up there blasting on anybody who's Japanese just because a Japanese person sent you the wrong documentation, and discriminated you by accident or on purpose with documentation, of course they're just going to send you home talking about we can't help you. I look at it as it should be that simple now, because Europeans, they have the argument that not all Europeans own slaves. Then they'll tell you some black people own slaves. So you can't argue that. It's true statements on both sides. But what you can argue is, okay, well, Massachusetts in this year, they set discriminatory laws against this group of people in this year, and these laws have never been redacted. So because of these laws, this group of people need to be justified and paid for their losses. That would include redlining, that would include the whole Jim Crow era, that would go back into how they first came over and pushed the Indians, so-called Indians, all the way from the East Coast out into the West, and signed all those treaties, which we all know about, and they never lived up to. They knew they wasn't going to own up to the treaties when they wrote them. They still wrote them, and which means they're valid. Just my thoughts.
No. I believe that you have some strong evidence that back up these statements, and something that needs to actually, like you said, needs to be looked into or investigated. And we will continue this conversation, and maybe we can find some additional assistance to clarify and clear up all this madness. So people out there at Hips News listening, stay tuned.
The first white man in the history of America ever convicted on the testimony of a black person. And that so scared them. The International Order of B'nai B'rith was involved in the Civil War.
Yeah, that's right.
It made a note of assuring that the rabbis gave the rabbinical ruling that justified slavery using the Bible.
Yeah, right.
You will not find any overt Jewish declaration against slavery in any document available in his story.